full-time professors, directors, and all of the supporting units, and also each and every single one of you. To begin, then, we will have the words from Mr. Jose Miguel Simian, who is the academic vice president. Good morning. It is a pleasure for me to greet all of you. 1 year ago, when we got together for this very same meeting in 2020, we were told that next year's meeting was going to be virtual. We would not have believed it. We would have thought that it was a fantasy, futuristic vision of our university. Yet, here we are, precisely on that stage, forced by circumstances to meet this way. There is no doubt that the changes that we have been forced to have challenged us like never before, and we have faced this both as obstacles as well as opportunities. We are by now tired and exhausted of screens, and we crave personal meetings. And that's why I want to thank so many of the faculty members joining us today, even if it is on the virtual mode. I also want to thank the presence of Professor James Lang, who will talk to us about teaching and especially about how to capture the attention of our students, something that we know has not been easy to achieve in these times of a pandemic. It is a topic on which we have certainly reflected upon, and where there are more doubts and uncertainties than certainties. I want to thank also the work that each and every single one of you has done in the year that has recently ended. It has been quite a demanding period and has required a great effort in terms of adaptation. We have had to make many changes to our courses and adapt them to virtual remote teaching. Many of us have learned to record classes. We have become experts in multi-platforms, Big Blue Button, Zoom, Teams, among many others. We are now more familiar with Canvas and are more creative when thinking about assessments. On the other hand, we also miss this personal contact with our students, which has been more difficult, but not impossible. Also want to mention in particular the effort that has been undertaken in the health area programs, overcoming many difficulties in trying to carry out the practical steps needed in their courses. To the extent that health conditions do not improve, most probably we will continue with this modality at least during the first half of this year. We hope to have more face-to-face classes during the second semester, but then the question is, what will that new present face-to-face encounters be like? Will it be worth booking a classroom? It does not seem reasonable to return to what we were doing before. The pandemic has accelerated a process that we saw was coming. There are activities that we know can be better done virtually, but then some others, it's more evident than ever that we need to do them face to face. Therefore, we must take advantage of this great opportunity and rethink the way that we teach. We have to restructure our courses and combine the virtual with the face-to-face modality in order to take advantage of both worlds. We are a university whose educational model is basically face-to-face. And we can still take advantage of technology to do some things even better. As teachers, we play multiple roles. We are, first of all, facilitators to discover knowledge. We are also considered experts in our disciplines, and we represent a formal authority before our students. We are also agents of socialization, and of course, we are people with whom they interact. How then do we play these roles in virtual teaching conditions? And how can we or should we be doing this in the future? In our courses, there's always a balance between the activities that students do on their own and those that take place in the classroom. Remote teaching must make students more responsible of their own learning, but it is also necessary to help them through specific instructions, videos, readings, quizzes, quizzes and questionnaires and surveys where we can measure how much they have truly learned. So in this context, the sequence of activities is important. Therefore, they require a design which can become a guide for learning, and probably it is there where we still have a lot to learn. It is worthwhile taking the time to acquire those new skills that will allow us to develop well with ease in the use of this new technology, and this will allow us to better connect with our students. The teaching of the 21st century, although it maintains the essence of always a community of teachers and students, has new means that we must learn to use to greater benefit. So, in this sense, I invite you to join the multiple initiatives that we are promoting from the Department of Teacher Development. During this week, we're holding dialogues, we're sharing best experiences, teaching activities, and individual support for the improvements for more specific enhancements. The university was recently awarded a project by the Ministry of Education in order to strengthen our teaching capacities, especially remote teaching. This will allow us to build more infrastructure and to strengthen skills in this area. All of this is quite good, but it is clearer than ever the value of being there face to face. This has been reinforced during the pandemic because nothing truly replaces these face to face speaking with students, realizing, understanding there and then, solving problems faster. Also, that helps in their learning with their peers. It is also important here then to mention that we must really take the time in order to create moments for providing feedback, conversation, dialogue with our students, and to truly take advantage of every single opportunity that we have when we are with them. Another challenge, evaluations and assessments. This is a recurrent topic in all other universities, not only in Chile, but also abroad. There are difficulties that have arisen from distance evaluations, which has forced us to be more creative, but it has also come to show the fragility of these assessments that are based on simply measuring acquired knowledge. In the coming months, we should be thinking about new ways of expanding and changing our assessments. Before closing, I want to make a brief mention to the new Teachers Regulation Code, which is being drafted. This regulation will propose a new model of academic programs for the teachers from Universidad de los Andes. As many of you will remember, last summer we had meetings with professors, deans, in order to collect opinions on the redrafting of the rules of teachers and the academic model. Between July and September, we disseminated a first draft version and we received many comments that we have included and that will be part of this new final version. And the main objective is to have an instrument that will help us to ensure excellence in each of the units that the university has and that will allow for teacher development with high teaching and research standards. This regulation is reasonably flexible in order to accommodate to very different academic units and departments, but at the same time demanding in trying to promote the development of professors at Universidad de los Andes. After having talked to many academic units and the configuration of these meetings and convocations, this regulation keeps both ordinary and extraordinary programs
De los profesores. Se busca además que la gran
and the
mayoría
encouragement for the development of the teachers so that they are categorized in an academic program. This is an objective that we have when it comes to the process of institutional accreditation. But beyond the accreditations, we think it is important in order to ensure the quality of our academic project. We hope to hold several meetings throughout the year to explain the scope of this new regulation and to continue the academic promotion processes. It'll be a new opportunity to meet virtually or maybe in person, face to face, if possible. Most likely, we will not see you till after the summer. So that's why I want to wish you the best in this year that's just beginning. And we hope that you'll be able to rest during the summer holidays. Hopefully, you will not face so many problems in trying to take these permits in order to move around the country or the city. And we hope that you can find the necessary energy so that you can come back in March with lots of eagerness. And now we will have Mr. James Lang deliver his presentation in today's meeting. His presentation, I believe, is entitled Teaching Sparking Interest in a World of Distractions. Karin Jurgensen will introduce our guest speaker, and after the conversation, she will be moderating the Q&A session.
Good morning, Mr. President, Professor Jose Antonio Guzmán, Professor James Lang of Assumption University, members of the Universidad de los Andes Board of Regents, my fellow deans, associate deans, and directors of administrative units, dear colleagues, students, and friends. Today's world is one of constant distractions. Information is at our fingertips, literally. Current communication and information technologies incite immediacy and a sense of urgency, stimulating constant distractions. Divided attention is sometimes difficult to manage. The COVID-19 pandemic has intensified these difficulties, adding personal strain to an already hectic situation. This poses unique challenges for academia. Ours is a human endeavor that requires full attention, concentration, thoughtfulness. In Professor Lang's own words, attention enables us to contemplate the truth, to focus on what matters, to achieve peace and wisdom. If finding the space for this is difficult for us academics, it is perhaps more so for our students. The theme of today's keynote presentation is how to adapt our pedagogy to a world full of distractions. We are honored to have with us an authority on the topic, Professor James Lang. Professor Lang holds a PhD in English literature from Northwestern University, and for the past 7 years, he has been director of the Damore Center for Teaching Excellence at Assumption University, a prestigious Catholic liberal arts college located in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he is also professor in the English department. Professor Lang is the author of some of the finest recent books on university teaching. These include On Course, a help guide for first-time faculty members, Cheating Lessons, dealing with pedagogical strategies to discourage academic dishonesty in our students, Small Teaching, on the little changes in teaching that have a big impact. This is a book that our own Center for Teaching Innovation, CEAT, regularly uses to train faculty. And more recently, a book that will serve as the inspiration for today's talk, Distracted, Why Students Can't Focus and What You Can Do About It. In his research, Professor Lang uses scientific evidence to promote best practices regarding students' learning, well-being, and intellectual and personal growth. At the Universidad de los Andes, we strive for excellence in teaching and learning and hope to provide students with a comprehensive education. Therefore, we are positive that Professor Lang is a perfect guest for this year's academic convocation. Professor Lang, who has woken up very early today to join us live from Worcester, will address us with today's keynote, and then we will open the conversation for questions. We invite our guests to write their questions in the YouTube chat box, and I will transmit as many to our guests as time allows. Please join me now in welcoming Professor James Lang.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. Yes, it is early in the morning here. And Karen mentioned a lot of distractions that are going on in the world around us, but neglected to mention the distraction that is always in our houses as well. And for me, I have my 5 children are out doing their remote schooling somewhere. My wife is teaching kindergarten online in the other room. So distractions beset us from every angle these days, not only in the sort of global sense, but also for many of us within our houses as well, as we're trying to get our teaching or learning done. So I'm going to talk to you this morning about distraction, attention, and education. And I'm going to tell you from the beginning, my goal is a simple one. I want to try and convince you that attention is an essential value in our teaching, that we should make attention a central value in our teaching, but it's not something that we can take for granted. In other words, we should not just expect or assume that students are going to pay attention in our classes. And in fact, if we want to make attention a fundamental value in the classroom experiences that we create, then we have to be deliberate about creating a learning environment that supports and sustains attention. And that's kind of the fundamental thing that I want to convince you of this morning. And then I am going to try to offer you some practical strategies for how you can make attention, how you can create that environment that supports and sustains attention. So that's kind of the big picture of the talk. I'm going to shoot to speak for about 30 minutes to leave us plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. You don't write a book about distraction and attention and then talk for an hour or more to people without giving them an opportunity to interject their own questions and make things a little bit more lively. So I will try to limit myself to around 30 minutes or so. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and we'll get started on the actual presentation. And so you can see I've titled the presentation, Teaching Distracted Minds. And that's a deliberate choice. That phrase is designed to communicate the idea that all of our minds are distracted. And so if we think about how to teach a distracted mind, what we're really thinking about is how to teach a human. Because it's not just sort of in the global pandemic that our minds are distracted. As I'm going to try to argue shortly, distraction is a really fundamental part of the human condition. And so a distracted mind is something that we always need to think about as we are planning and conducting our teaching. I want to begin with a couple slides which kind of convey a more philosophical perspective on this issue. And I really like Yves Citone's argument here that we might think about teaching as the art of directing attention. In fact, the essential task of a teacher is to heighten the ability of students to notice what is remarkable and important in what we are looking at. You might think about this in terms of your own discipline, which is a vast terrain, which includes many, many facts, ideas, skills, concepts, and theories. And your task as a teacher is to select the ones that you believe are most fundamental for students to learn and orient the attention of your students to that material. I teach British literature, and during the time period that I teach, there are thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of works of literature that were created. And it's my task as the teacher to identify the ones that I think are most essential for my students to learn and to direct the attention of my students toward that material. So we are attention directors. And so that kind of helps us think philosophically about why it's so important for us to consider attention as we are designing and conducting our teaching. Now, to shift down a little bit more into the cognitive level, one of the things that we absolutely know about attention, and that you'll see in the sort of, if you take this sort of, slightest dip into the attention research, is that attention is a limited capacity resource. And so I like Michelle Miller's book here, Minds Online. Michelle Miller is a cognitive psychologist who writes about these matters. And what she points out is that within the human cognitive system, attention is a limited resource. So as designers of learning experiences, which is what we are, we should think about ourselves as stewards of the students' limited stores of attention. And this talk fundamentally is about what kind of stewards are we being? How good is our stewardship of the limited stores of attention of our students? So that's a kind of, those two slides kind of help set up the idea here that attention is something that deserves our attention and that we need to think carefully about the role that it plays in our classroom and about the role that we are playing in sustaining and supporting student attention. Now, basically the talk's going to be in 3 parts here, all very brief. I'm going to start by talking a little bit, just showing you a few examples of the way that writers throughout history have spoken about the problem of attention and distraction. Then I'm going to shift into a few slides that'll focus on sort of the biology of it. Why are people distracted, and has that changed in recent years? And then I'll get into the practical suggestions as well. So I'd like to start here by giving a little bit of historical perspective on this issue. We tend to think about distraction as being a modern problem, and we're especially thinking about it being a modern problem right now with all the distractions going on in the world around us, and as I said, in our homes. But in fact, we look back at the history of writers talking about attention and distraction and their minds, you will see over and over again writers, philosophers, thinkers talking about the problems that humans have paying attention. And so we're going to begin here with Aristotle. Aristotle, in his Ethics, writes that people who are passionately devoted to the flute are unable to pay attention to arguments if they hear someone playing a flute, since they enjoy the flute playing more than the activity that presently occupies them. And I want you to substitute paying attention to arguments, sitting in your class, and playing the flute, being on their phone, right? So what Aristotle is making a very simple point here, when we are asked to do something difficult cognitively, like pay attention to an argument, we are easily tempted away from that by something that is easier or more pleasant, the sound of someone playing a flute, right? And so from the more than 2,000 years ago, we see writers talking about the extent to which humans are easily distracted. Aristotle's making the point here that it's easy to fall away from distractions to when we're trying to do something difficult. In another section of the Ethics, which I don't have quoted here, he talks about the fact that in the theater, people are more likely to eat snacks noisily and distract themselves when the acting is bad. So in fact, Aristotle makes 2 points about this. One is when we're having to do something hard, we tend to want to distract ourselves. And when there's something that's boring us or that we don't find all that interesting, likewise there, we go to distractions. And this should sound pretty familiar to you in terms of the complaints that teachers make to one another about our distractible students today. Now, the book goes through a much sort of longer history of this. I'm going to skip around historically, so I'm going to jump forward a couple thousand years here. But I like to also show this quote from a writer in the 18th century, a British writer named Isaac Watts, who wrote a manual about how to improve your mind. Right? So this was kind of like a self-help book in the 18th century. And one of the things that Isaac Watts was responding to was the rise of coffee shops. Coffee shop culture kind of sprang up in Europe, and these became scenes of kind of buzzing action, and people would go there and get the news and gossip and read newspapers. And so there were these kind of very active sites. And so Isaac Watts is in part responding to this when he talks about, he gives advice to people about where they should study and learn. And what he says is, don't choose your place of study by the most various entertaining scenes. Don't go to places like coffee shops to try to study, because when you're there, a variety of objects which strike the eye or the ear, especially while they are in motion or often changing, have a tendency to steal away the mind too often from its steady pursuit of any subjects which we contemplate. And this is the striking part of this quote. And thereby the soul gets in a habit of trifling and wandering. And what's striking about that quote is that we tend to think today, like one of the things that we say now is that our phones are distracting us in such a way, they're destroying our ability to pay attention, right? That's the kind of the narrative that we hear. We can no longer pay attention as we used to. And Isaac Watts is saying something quite similar. If you go to a coffee shop and get distracted, you're going to become a distractible person, right? You become a person who's easily subject to distraction. So what we see here is that the kind of concerns that we have today about what's happening to us, they're pretty ancient concerns. My favorite visual of this is a cartoon that comes from the British magazine Punch. And this is a cartoon in which was published at the end of the year 1906, which is sort of forecast what's going to happen in 1907. So you have here two, fancily dressed people sitting with their telegraph machines. And the cartoon says, these two figures are not communicating with one another. The lady is receiving a love note and the gentleman is getting his racing results. And so you might put this cartoon in dialogue with, the things that we see today in which, students are just looking at their phones and not paying attention to one another, right? And we have this kind of, accusatory tone that why don't students pay attention to one another? Well, they were quite concerned about that well over 100 years ago as well. And I see, by the way, the sun is coming up in my window behind me and putting some strange light on my face, but hopefully that'll end shortly as the sun gets above the window. Okay, so that's the kind of quick little history I want to do. And it's just designed to show you the extent to which these concerns about distraction and attention are ancient ones. As long as people have been writing about their minds, they've been writing about the distractibility of their minds and about the difficulties that they have in paying attention. Now, this raises a really interesting question. Why? One of the things that you see in the dialogue, historical dialogues about distraction and attention is we tend to be unhappy about it. We tend to wish that we could pay better attention. Most of the historical quotes that you see about attention and distraction are laments, right? Why can't we pay better attention? Which raises this question. Why do we have this quality? Now, just a few slides on that as well. One of the things, the ways that cognitive psychologists talk about attention is the idea that when we are sort of trying to concentrate on study or learning or whatever it might be, we are using what they call directed attention. So our directed attention is what students are having to use when they are sitting in a classroom and trying to pay attention to what you are, teaching to them. But one of the things that we absolutely know about directed attention, and you will know it from your own personal experience, directed attention fatigues. So this is from psychologist Stephen Kaplan. Directed attention requires effort. It plays a role in achieving focus. It's under our voluntary control, at least some of the time, because we all know that we can be sort of pulled away from what we're doing by involuntary things, right? Any minute now, my wife is going to start her kindergarten classroom and I'm going to hear her singing a song about the weather, right? And so that's going to catch my attention. But the last part here is important. Any prolonged mental effort leads to directed attention fatigue. So attention fatigues over time, right? So this is important to understand because we are often asking students to come into classes or come into Zoom calls and pay attention for long periods of time. We see this actually in a great study that came out in 2014 about the extent to which students watch streaming videos. Now, if you look at here, what they were studying, this was actually from a study of more than 7 million students viewing videos in large open online courses. So this is from 4 very large open online courses called MOOCs. And so they were able to, these MOOCs have been run over and over again with hundreds of thousands of students. So they were able to look in these courses to see how much the students watched the online videos. And what you see here, which were the online lecture videos, and what you see here is very striking. Up until when the videos were up like 10 minutes long or shorter, for the most part, students watch them. But you can see as the video lectures get longer, the students watch less and less of them. So when the videos got, to be a half hour or 40 minutes long, like the kind of talk I'm giving to you today, students only watched around 20% of them on average. So this is a good demonstration of the challenges that we face with our directed attention. We have an easier time paying attention for shorter periods, but as the period stretches out, it becomes more and more challenging to us. So our directed attention is subject to fatigue. There's a lot of other things which kind of draw our attention away. And so one of the most fundamental things to understand is that sort of in our long evolution, right, it was essential for us to be able to pay attention, for example, to, to hunt and to sort of pay attention to our social groups. But it was also really important for us to be aware of our surroundings. So actually, we kind of have two forms of attention. We have the directed attention that we can pay, and we have this more sort of ambient attention, which is aware of what's going on around us, right? And so that is oftentimes why we get distracted, because we're paying attention to the other things that are happening in the room or in our environment. And of course, that was essential for us, right? As we were evolving, if you paid too close attention to something that was just happening in front of you, you might well have been subject to a predator, right? So most animals actually have the kind of these two forms of attention, the ability to pay attention and yet the awareness of the environment, which can easily draw us away. Now, the other thing that's fundamental about humans and actually other primates is that we are especially drawn to novelty. So we love to get kind of new information, and our brain seeks stimulation through novelty. So again, when we are asking students to kind of pay direct attention to something that's difficult and challenging, they can wear down, and yet the brain is kind of looking for novel things, like it's looking for stimulation. While our challenges of distraction and attention are ancient, what's new is that our devices today are incredibly effective at providing us with an endless supply of novelty. And what's really striking, and so you see here from Nur Ayal, who was actually a video game designer, who then wrote a book about how companies can help hook the attention of people into their devices by giving them a constant stream of novelty. So as he argues here, not only have they done this, but they have an incredible amount of money and time that has gone into the process of creating novelty machines. So as infinite distractions compete for our attention, he argues, companies are learning to master novel tactics to stay relevant in users' minds. And what's striking about this device is the effectiveness it has in giving us constant novelty. I can look at my email on my phone. When that's tapped out, I can go to Twitter. When I'm done with that, I can shift to Instagram. From there, I'm going to look at the weather. Then I might check a map to see where I'm going later today. And when that's all done, I've probably got more email. So in that one little device, I have a kind of constant stream of novelty and new information, and our brains love this. So that is why it's very difficult and challenging for us to kind of keep our directed attention going, especially when we are having to do something difficult and challenging. So the point I want to make by kind of putting the first two parts of this presentation together is we have always had distractible brains. There's no question about that writers have been talking about this for a long time. What's different today is not that our brains are somehow more distracted. The architecture of our brains hasn't changed in some way. What's different is that our devices have gotten really good at playing on our distractibility. And that's what we have to think about. Now, if you take one thing away from my presentation today, this is what I want you to take away from it. This is the most important point. All of this tells us that we need to think about attention not as the norm, and distraction is a falling away from that. Attention is the achievement. We need to think about paying attention as an achievement, something that you're able to do and not that you do effortlessly. Multiple steps are needed to ensure that you end up aware of what the stimuli you're interested in and not pulled off track by irrelevant inputs. And there's actually two things in that statement. Attention requires focusing on what's in front of you. It also requires blocking out the things that are around you and that are in here, right? Because we can be drawn away from our directed attention, not only by the environment, but by our internal thoughts. So this is the most important thing that I want to communicate in the book and in this presentation. Recognize that attention is achievement. And when we recognize that, then we are more willing to take the steps that will help our students support and sustain their attention. And that's what we're going to now shift to. So I want to focus on how we get from distraction to attention. In the book, there's a half dozen or so sort of principles that we can use and lots of recommendations for strategies. Here in our sort of brief remaining time, I want to focus on just three of those things: community, structure, and assessment. And each of those, for each of these three things, just a few slides and a recommendation or two. What I want to point out about community here is that attention is reciprocal. The more attention I pay to you, the more attention you are likely to pay to me. And so one of the things that we want to think about as faculty members is how we are creating an environment in which we are paying attention to one another, and that we are saying that it's important for us to pay attention to each other, and not just students sitting there like zombies staring at the front of the room. Attention is something that should be circulating throughout the room, but it's also a gift that we give to one another, right? So the students, we need to think about how do we communicate to the students that it's important for them to pay attention to their fellow students when they're speaking. Those ideas that your students are giving to the room are valuable, and we all should be attentive to them. And I should be attentive to the ideas of my students, as I hope they are attentive to the ideas that I'm communicating to them. So how do we do that? I'm going to suggest that we need to think about inviting students into the process of making attention a value. In other words, as a community, we need to think about how we are creating attention as a fundamental value. And I want to sort of come from a researcher who wrote about discussion and engagement in the classroom. And he wrote this book called Discussion in the College Classroom, Jay Howard. And Jay Howard argued that in classrooms of any kind, there are certain behavioral norms that operate. So for example, he writes about discussion and the kinds of behavioral norms that either promote or interfere with good discussions. And one of the behavioral norms he talks about is what he calls the consolidation of responsibility, which every teacher will have experienced. And what he means by that is sometimes in a class, 3 or 4 students will be the students that always raise their hand, right? And all of the other students know there are going to be a few students who want to do all the talking. And so the rest of us get to sit here quietly and don't have to talk. Now, Howard argues that that is a behavioral norm that the students have seen over and over again in their classes. And when they get into your class, no matter what you might say to them, they know that's going to happen. And they learn to behave according to that norm. What I want to suggest, and there you see Jay Howard's book on the right-hand side of the screen, is that there are also attention norms that operate in our classes. And we have to first think about what are the attention norms that are shaping the experience of your students? And what are the attention norms that you want to operate in the classroom? And if you think about that last question then, how do you help establish those norms, right? So you might have attention norms that are operating right now in your online classes that you're unhappy about. Maybe you get into class and all you see are a bunch of black boxes, muted screens. You're seeing students that are not really fully engaging. You're seeing students going into breakout rooms and not really speaking, right? So there might be a lot of norms that are operating right now that students are experiencing in multiple classes that they started in the spring, they've experienced throughout the fall. You can't just take for granted, you're not going to change those norms by just saying, hey, participate. You actually have to think about what are the norms operating here, because those norms are powerful. Behavioral norms shape how we experience any situation. How are you going to reshape those norms? And what I'm going to suggest here is taking a few simple steps. At the beginning of the semester, the first thing we need to do is inform our students about the challenges of attention and distraction. So students tend to think that distraction is a private issue. If I'm distracting myself, that's nobody's business but my own. But in fact, that's not true. And Ashley Wagner-Denton here is a researcher that I've drawn this quote from. And I show this quote to my students at the beginning of the semester. because I want to communicate to them that what the research tells us in a face-to-face classroom is that when you are distracting yourself on your device, you are actually distracting the other students around you as well. So as you see here from this study, in one study, students who were not using a device in a class lecture, but that were seated within the view of a peer with a device, performed 17% worse on an exam based on that material than the students who could not see someone else's device. So the student who's distracting him or herself in a face-to-face classroom has the potential to distract other students. In a Zoom classroom, it's a little bit different, but it's still the case that when students have pulled away and are not engaging in the classroom, we are losing their good ideas. We are losing their potential contributions that have the power to enrich all of our understanding. And so I want to make sure that, first of all, I communicate that to students. Your attention matters here because your ideas matter. And I want to make sure that those ideas get into the classroom and that we all hear and pay attention to one another's ideas. So that's the first thing I think we have to do. We have to let students know attention matters to me, and I want you to understand why. The next thing we have to do is invite their feedback and good ideas. Your students, you know what you do in class. Your students are in multiple classes and have teachers who are doing lots of creative and interesting things. And if you're feeling challenged in terms of attention and distraction, one of your peers might be doing something really interesting that you'll never find out about, but your students might know about it. So invite them to help you create an environment that sustains and supports attention. Ask them, what helps you? We're all in a difficult time right now. What have other faculty members done that have either interfered with or really supported well your attention? And we can do this in lots of ways. In a face-to-face classroom, you can just open a conversation about it. Ask them to write down, what are the 3 things that have been most important or most helpful to you in sustaining your attention in an online class? Or the opposite, what are the things that send you to your distractions? Open up a discussion board post and ask them to give you, to report to you what other faculty members have done that have been really helpful or have not been so helpful to them in terms of attention and distraction. So invite them into the conversation, right? So we want to make sure that their voices are valued in this conversation. And the last thing is when we are presenting to them, so then let's say we do this, we show the students, we invite their feedback, and then we come up with some way to try to, some norms that we want to operate in the classroom, and we set those norms, and we agree that these are the things that we're going to do in class. Make sure you're presenting those norms in warm and empathetic language, right? So there's actually some interesting research on the role of warm and cold language in syllabi. Cold language just tells students what to do and give them the rules. Warm language helps explain why we have those rules, and it invites students to, it helps recognize that empathy and understanding for students. So here's a warm language presentation of a technology policy. For example, we're all challenged these days by the ways in which our devices can steal our attention away from our surroundings. We all are, including me. Our technology policy is designed to support our attention to one another and to the course material. So be open about the fact that this policy, that you recognize the challenges that they're facing and that you want to work with them in order to create a policy that helps supports everyone's attention. So community, recognizing that attention is reciprocal, right? And that we want to pay attention to one another, and that the students can play a role in helping create your attention value in classroom. Okay, number 2 here, structure. So I want to talk about the idea that structure is essential for sustaining and supporting attention. And here I would just encourage you to think about the situations in which you are being asked to pay directed attention. Like, for example, this talk, or a faculty meeting, or a lecture that you go to or attend, or, for example, a play, right? And so for thousands of years, there have been artists whose job it has been to think about how to sustain the attention of human beings through long experiences, like plays or symphonies, right? And one of the things that you see is their recognition that audiences need change and variety and breaks. So if you think about what happens in a play, right? You sit in the theater, you get a program that tells you what's going to happen. There are changes of scene, there are changes of act, and there are intermissions. And the same thing when you go to the symphony, right? So when we go to these experiences where people have had to think for a long time about how do you keep a human's attention, you're going to see some pretty persistent strategies like the ones you see on the screen here. And one of the things I just like to encourage people to do is to, again, just think about like the next time you're in an experience which requires your direct attention, what's helping and what's sending you to your distractions? And what can you learn from that for your own classroom? Now, I argue that faculty need to think a little bit more about the classroom as a modular experience. In other words, we need to think about the different things we do in classroom as kind of units or modules, and then consider deliberately how we are changing what we are doing over the course of a classroom experience, and thinking deliberately about attention in relationship to those things. I sat through a workshop a couple of years ago, and I write about it in the book, in which the facilitator had us write down on index cards all the different things that we did in class. And so you see some of the things I wrote down on my index cards: a mini lecture, a writing exercise, a group worksheet, a video clip. I had about 10 things on my index cards. And then she had us do something quite fascinating. She said, I want you to think about the next class you're going to teach. Start shuffling the cards around and see how the class might unfold in different ways that would support the engagement, learning, and attention of your students. This was a fascinating exercise. I highly recommend that you do it yourself. You can do it with index cards, you can do it on a whiteboard, you can do it with slips of paper, but think deliberately about how is that experience unfolding over time for your students, and what are the kind of variations and changes that you're offering that will sort of renew their attention over the course of a class period. So think about how you're designing for attention, and what is the kind of, what lessons you can take from these kinds of other people like playwrights, composers, good lecturers, folks who help support and sustain attention throughout a period. Now, the last thing I want to say about structure is, at the beginning, first slide I showed, I mentioned that you get a playbill when you get to the theater, right? It tells you, here's what's going to happen. When you go to the symphony, you get a program, tells you what's going to happen. And one of the things that you will notice about really effective speakers is the way they make their structure transparent. That is, they show you where you are in the presentation. They give you frequent reminders. They let you know sort of how much longer are we going to go on. This is our second point. There are these constant signposting. And I want you to think about, again, your own experience listening to lectures at conferences, right? And when you have a speaker that just sort of starts speaking and just, there's no structure to the talk, and you have no idea where it's going or when it's going to end, how long does it take you to check out, right? As opposed to a speaker who guides you through and lets you know, this is the second point of my 3 points, or the speaker that lets you know, we've got about 10 minutes left here. And when you hear those things, you go, oh, okay, yeah. And then your attention perks back up again, right? So this is an easy thing for any faculty member to do, to make sure students are always aware of these 3 things. What are we doing right now? Why are we doing it? And what's next? You can do this by putting a structure on the board, by having a slide at the beginning of the presentation that shows what's going to happen, and by just frequent oral reminders of where you are in the class to help students recognize how the experience is going to continue to unfold. And again, think about the wisdom of those artists whose job it is to keep our attention. Okay, so that's simple points on structure, making sure that you are kind of thinking about the design of the experience and how it unfolds, for varying your techniques, and then making that structure transparent. Last point I want to make here is about assessment. And I believe that assessment has a role to play in attention, in supporting and sustaining attention in the classroom. I've written in the past about the fact that we have, psychologists sometimes will point out 2 sort of very large buckets of attention There's motivation for learning. Extrinsic motivation means you're motivated by your by the goal, like wanting to earn a good grade, for example, or win an award or whatever it might be, graduate. I'm just focused on the goal. Intrinsic motivation is more like, I'm really interested in the subject matter. I'm doing this because I care about it. Now, we tend to valorize intrinsic motivation. We believe students should just want to do it because they care about it and love it, right? And of course we want that. But I think we have to be realistic here. And again, we have to look at what happens in the world outside of us. And I love to point people to this example in terms of exercise, right? We know that we should exercise. It's good for us. It makes us feel good. It keeps us healthy. But how many of us give ourselves rewards for exercising as well? So what you see, I'm not sure how well this will translate, but in the US, we have these things called Couch to 5K, right? And it's something that you're designed to get you off your couch and start exercising, because the goal is you're going to run a 5K race, right? So even though people know they should exercise and they should be intrinsically motivated, they still nudge themselves along with these kinds of extrinsic motivators. And I want you to think about the extent to which that should be true in your classroom as well. When you teach, you hope students love the material, you hope they're inspired intrinsically and want to do it, but there's nothing wrong with helping students recognize what's important in a course through low stakes assessments on the work they do in the classroom. Assessments help students recognize where to direct their attention in a course. Students are navigating multiple courses. There's all kinds of distractors, just like you are. Your assessed work helps direct their attention to the things that are most essential in that class. So that, of course, that's true with your tests and quizzes, but I want to suggest actually, even sort of for the in-class work that you might be doing, or when you're having students complete a group work task in a Zoom breakout room, putting a little bit of stakes on that kind of work is not punishing students. It's actually helping them, because it's showing them this is important. And if you do this work, it's going to ultimately help you. Yes, they should want to do it. They should be intrinsically motivated. But again, just like we sometimes need extrinsic motivators to get us off the couch, they might need a little bit of extrinsic motivation to get them going. So what I suggest is very simple. Identify the most important engagement activity you want your students to complete each day or each week. Take a look at it, collect it on paper or electronically, and have it make a minimal contribution to the students' grades. Set aside 10%, 15%, and say these weekly engagement activities, as long as you complete them, you're going to get this grade. And that's a great thing to be able to say to students. All you have to do is be here and do the work. And 15% of your grade is a guaranteed A, right? Because that is, these are important activities that are going to help you learn. And you see here on the side is an annotated poem. This is something I love to have my students do. I give them a poem and I just say, annotate everything you can think about this poem. And that's, then once they've all done that, then we get together and we talk about it. This annotation is really meaningful. This one maybe is a little quirky, doesn't apply as much, but it's a great conversation starter. And I take these up afterwards, look at them, make sure that they're done, see what good ideas came up, give them back. It's very simple, easy, and quick. Okay, so Mary Oliver is an American poet who I believe is sort of the poet of attention. And she, as she explains here, I cite her several times in the book, attention is something we should value not only in our classes, but in our lives. To pay attention, this is our endless and proper work. And I think the last point I want to make here is about the classroom or the course experience as being like an attention retreat, right? So when we go on retreats, we get away from the world around us and we are allowed to focus on something that's really meaningful and important. And we should think about our classroom that way as well. There's so much going on in the world around us that's distracting and anxious, anxiety provoking. When we get students together in the classroom, we have the opportunity to learn together, and that should be a joyful experience, a joyful and meaningful experience. So to make attention a value in the classroom, you have the potential to give your students a real gift. the opportunity to step away from all of that anxiety that's going on in the world around us and to come and focus on something that's important or beautiful or meaningful. Some great books to look at if you are interested in attention. Now You See It by Kathy Davidson is a good sort of overview of the role of attention in our sort of ever-changing world of technology. The Distracted Mind that you see there in the middle is a very good overview of more kind of fundamentally like the brain research on attention and distraction. And then you see my book over there on the right. And if you are a Twitter person, I try to focus to post things on distraction, attention, learning, education on my Twitter feed, as well as occasional distracting asides. So you're welcome to join that conversation on Twitter as well. Okay, so that is it. I am going to stop sharing my screen now and shift back. And I'm really looking forward to the questions and conversation.
Well, thank you, Professor Lang. This was really an amazing presentation. And let me just begin by telling you that during your talk, I heard nothing else around me, no flutes or phones, nor any snacks, which is pretty difficult for me usually. So it was really engaging and fun. And I really annotated a lot of things that you said for my future own preparation of syllabi and class. So well, let me, many questions have actually already come in, but I'm going to take the moderator's advantage and ask something that I myself want to know from this. One of the last things you mentioned actually really made me think about a habit or a system that we use a lot in Chilean universities and in high schools, which is similar to what you said about setting aside 10% or something of the final grade to engage students in activities that will help them learn. But many times, and maybe for decades, what we've actually done is something we call like participation in class, you know? So there's this 10% of participation in class. And actually students here still think that is, they just have to, you know, raise their hand and talk a lot, talk about anything at all. And so, you know, so professor learns his face or name. And then at the end of the semester, you know, says, yeah, this one talked a lot. So he's going to get an A in participation in class. And so what's your take on that kind of thing to engage students, you know, just I guess you prefer that we have like very specific activities. What can you tell us about that?
I do prefer that. I'm not now there's many ways to teach well, and so I don't want anyone to think I'm, you know, condemning that practice. But I've moved away from that in my own teaching because ultimately I came to feel like there was sort of subject to various biases. When I just set aside 10% and said, this is for participation, and the more you participate, you know, the higher that grade will be. I mean, you know, I've got several classes. I've got dozens of students in each class. It's incredibly challenging for me to keep track of who's participating. And ultimately, at the end of the semester, if there's a student who spoke the last 2 weeks of the semester, but then was quiet for the first 13, I'm going to remember that and think, oh yeah, that student spoke a lot, but maybe it really didn't. And there are some students who, for very understandable reasons, might have challenges to participation. For example, they might be slower processors, right? So they process problems and questions more slowly. And the eager participators always get their hand up immediately. And those students maybe don't get a chance to speak as much. So I actually really favor, if we're going to take 10 or 15% and don't call it a, you know, participation grade, it's an engagement grade. And I believe that grade should be based on products that students create in these engagement activities. And again, they can be very low stakes. Like I said, you know, for me, when students do those worksheets, I have a 15% you know, bin for engagement activities. There's at least one a week over the course of the semester, so they essentially each count for 1%. And as long as you do it, you get that grade, right? And so it's an easy way for me to make sure that students are engaged every day, but I have some record of it. It's not just me kind of like eyeballing it and trying to see like who spoke and who didn't. I do, my fear about that is that it's subject to bias. Not only like potential bias about like who the students are, but just like my own memory, like, and, you know, like recent versus early speaking. So that is my take on that. I believe we'd be much better off focusing that kind of participation grade on the engagement activities that student, and even in an online class, you know, you can give students a task and set up a Google Doc and have students all creating a Google Doc. And as long as everyone creates that Google Doc, or if they're in their breakout rooms, everyone create 3 slides that then we'll all look at together, right? There's plenty of ways to do this both online and in person. So that's my take on that.
Thank you. Excellent. So one of the questions that we have received is, can you explain cognitive load in our students and how it affects attention, you know, what we can do to relate cognitive load with attention?
Yeah, so cognitive load just refers to, you know, how much sort of stuff is we're trying to process at the same time, right? So like how much can we handle in terms of like what's in our working memories at any given moment? And of course, that's limited. You know, our working memories are where we sort of do our thinking essentially, right? And there's a limited number of items that we can hold in our working memories. So that can be easily overloaded. But it also might refer to the fact that sometimes we may be trying to process things that are beyond our current skill or ability level, right? And so in those moments, we feel that sense of like overload or overwhelmed. What the attention, how this intersects with attention is people tend to kind of opt out or stop paying attention if the load is too heavy, but also if it's too light, right? So like if I'm being really challenged by something that's difficult for me, I might just say it's too much and I'm just gonna go do something. I'm gonna like just look at my phone instead because I just don't get it. But it also might be the case that like, oh, I know this. I've done this before in another class. There too, I might check out. So this, I think, is one of the most difficult challenges of teaching in general. We have to try to find that place where students are being challenged, but not too much, because either being challenged not enough or being challenged too much, both of those things can send us to our distractions. And, you know, I've been giving talks about teaching for a long time, and I've basically been able to come up with answers for most things that people ask me. But the one thing that I don't think there is a good and easy answer to is, how do you teach to a room full of people of different abilities? There's no easy answer to that. That is just what we have to continually struggle with as teachers. You know, there's things we can try and do, but I think we're always going to be challenged by that. And it intersects with attention, because teaching to that sort of sweet middle spot is what is going to help sustain attention.
It's as if you guessed the next question, because that was actually the next question: how to deal with a variety of students in a classroom. we can skip that one; it's answered already.
Yeah, the answer is I don't know.
Yeah. So here's another interesting question from one of our scholars at the School of Education, and it says, "Do you have any suggestions about how to help students avoid distractions while they are doing course readings, like, you know, so that they really understand what they're reading when one sends them course readings?"
Yeah, I mean, just, you know, we can talk to our students about these things and recommend things to them. I think that's, you know, we should, when we're talking about distraction at the beginning of the semester, or attention and how we want it to be a norm in our classroom, we can certainly make recommendations. And some of the recommendations that you've probably heard about, like how to be more productive in your own work, are good here. They're the things I tell my own children. You know, don't study, for example, with, you know, screens on, like other screens on, right? And, you know, that's a hard sell for today's students. However, what's the thing that I think is easiest for them to do is to say, look, we know, your phone is an important thing. You have it on you. You want to look at it. Give yourself 15 or 30 minutes where you flip it over and don't look at it. And then after 15 or 30 minutes, stop and take a look and do everything you want to do on it. And then flip it back over again, right? So just set yourself dedicated periods, even if they're short ones, 15 or 30 minutes. I've had to learn this in my own life. When I used to write, I had my email open and maybe there was Twitter open. And I've kind of learned over the past couple of years to do this. I set, 30 to 60 minutes, everything gets closed out but the Word document. And then when I've written for 60 minutes, then I get to look at Twitter and do these other things for a while and reward myself. And I think that's what we have to try to communicate to students. We can just recommend those kind of good things. And of course, reading or studying with their pens or annotating online, as much of that as they can do, that's going to help keep their attention directed. It's also true that if they go into a reading with a goal or like with something they know they're trying to get out of that's more likely to keep their attention focused. So for example, when students read, oftentimes textbooks have like pre-reading questions before the chapter. And those are designed for a reason, because we tend to do better at comprehending, reading, and paying attention when we have a question in mind. And so we can do that for students as well. When they're going off to do the reading, here's 2 things I want you to think about as you're doing this reading. And when you're done, I'm going to ask you to write about that, right? Like those are things we can put a little structure around the readings in order to help them. If you just send students off and say, read this difficult stuff and we'll talk about it, again, you're probably not giving them the support they need. So giving them reading questions and holding them accountable for the reading afterwards through discussion board posts or in-class writing, those are the things that are going to help.
Wonderful, thank you. So in your book, you talk about the importance of emotion and mindfulness and attention. Do professors need to engage the students' emotions? And why not say maybe even their heart in order to get them to pay better attention? What does the research say about that?
So I was part of a major grant-funded study. I had a whole chapter about this that didn't end up making it into the book because for a number of reasons, but I was part of a major grant-funded study a few years ago that we conducted through our teaching center with some colleagues from other institutions, in which we had students complete some activities at the beginning of the class period. And there were different ones, and then we gave them quizzes at the material on the end, and then a final sort of test at the end of the semester to see which of these activities had the greatest impact on their learning. One of those activities was a brief mindfulness exercise in which they kind of practiced, paying attention to their emotions and being mindful of their, breathing, that kind of thing. Another was something called cognitive reappraisal, in which we asked the students to, we gave students the tools for cognitive appraisal. In other words, we told them they had an iPad, and the iPad guided them through a few minutes of thinking about this issue. And that cognitive reappraisal thing was, and cognitive reappraisal just means you an experience or an emotion or something that you're having, you change your way of thinking about it. So this cognitive reappraisal activity essentially said things to students like, you might find yourself bored or frustrated in class. That's totally normal. That happens to everyone. And when you find that happening, here are a couple things that you could do differently. Which of these things would you like to try in this class period, right? What we found was, and then there were other things. There was actually one of the other things was just a sort of content focused thing where we had them do a little focusing on course content for a few minutes and engaging in an activity. What we found was actually the cognitive reappraisal strategy was the one that had the most positive impact. So when we acknowledge the fact that students, when we normalize for students the fact that it was difficult to pay attention in class and that everyone experienced this and that there were things they could do that would help them, that actually had the best impact. The brief kind of mindful technique that we had them do, it didn't really have an impact beyond what the control condition was. So my take on this is twofold. What we learned from that study was part of what I've been argued throughout the presentation. We need to be empathetic and understanding, and we need to be explicit with students that attention is difficult, and there are things that we can do to help, right? That I can do as the teacher and the students can do as well. So that's one thing. Now the second part, and I think this was part of your question as well, in terms of engaging the emotions of students and their minds and hearts, like about the course content and in the material as well. That's also really important. I would recommend Sarah Kavanaugh's book, The Spark of Learning, which is about how we can use emotions to help cultivate engagement and attention and learning in higher education. And Sarah Kavanaugh argues that there are certain emotions that are really productive in terms of promoting learning, like curiosity, when we can make people curious, a sense of well-being or sort of joy or happiness. People are more receptive to learning when they're in a positive mind frame. There are other emotions like sort of feeling sort of challenged, but again, in a way that you feel like you're capable of it. So, there are emotions can play a really positive role in engaging attention. They can also play a really negative role too, right? Like if I'm scared or threatened, that takes up all of my cognitive bandwidth, and I don't have anything left over for what you're trying to teach me. So in a classroom environment that's threatening, that's negative, where students are afraid of just saying the wrong thing, all those things are gonna draw attention away. So for people that want more on the role of emotions in cultivating attention, I really recommend Sarah's book, The Spark of Learning.
Very interesting. Sometimes teachers confuse those kind of emotional help to students with telling about their private lives. What is your take on that? I've heard about professors who, think that students engage if they know more about the professor's private life. Last night I couldn't sleep because my little child, whatever. What do you think about that?
Sarah Kavanaugh's book is also very good on this. And there is a literature actually on self-disclosure. So there's some research on this about the extent to which self-disclosure by teachers is something that, how does that impact the learning environment? Essentially my takeaway is that it argues two things. First of all, it should be moderate. You don't want to be like a robot up there. The students don't recognize you as a human, but you don't also want to be too personal, right? You don't want to present yourself as, you don't want to overshare, right? As we say in English. The other thing that the literature suggests, though, is that what we share should be more positive. We should be sharing sort of our passions or our interests or the things that, that might happen in our lives that are funny or intriguing. It's not that great of an idea to sort of constantly share the negative aspects of your life. Of course, we're all suffering in the pandemic. And of course, you have things that happen in your life that are negative, and that there's nothing wrong with doing that occasionally. But if you're kind of relentlessly sharing the fact that you're struggling, that can sort of dampen the environment of the room. And so you want to try to think about, having a kind of, as much as possible in this crazy environment that we're living in right now, being positive and trying to be a good sort of positive role model for the students.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. So the book Distracted, Why Students Can't Focus and What You Can Do About It. You wrote this book before the pandemic. So what would you like to add to it? Or what have you learned during the pandemic regarding attention and that you would like to would have been in that book?
I think I probably would have been a little bit more attentive to the way that we can be distracted by, as we all know, there's been a kind of mental health crisis, right, unfolding alongside the physical health crisis, right? And so there's been this kind of rise of our general level of anxiety in society, and people dealing with people going to doctors for more clinical levels of anxiety, but also a kind of general rise in our anxiety. And I've absolutely felt this as well during the election, the U.S. election 2 months ago, and the pandemic is going on, and I could just feel my heart rate rising a little bit every day, and then that kind of thing eats at your attention. And so when there's that kind of worry in your head, it's always kind of taking a little bit of your mental bandwidth away from you and making it more and more challenging to attention. So I think I would have been I might have even had like a chapter about that, like about the way anxiety and kind of negative emotions and the things that are going around can really interfere with our students' ability to pay attention and our own ability to pay attention, right? Actually, I'm working with an editor on something, and she was supposed to send me something yesterday, and we had a lot of unrest in the United States this week, and she sent it to me finally a day late and said, "I'm sorry, I just couldn't work yesterday." Right? That's like happening constantly right now, right? So I think I probably would have been a little bit more explicitly about that, and about how we can try to maybe address that as well.
Thank you. So what is your vision? This could be the last question to then give space for our president to address also the big audience that is listening today. And so what do you think are like what will remain in technology and classrooms, like in blended things or hybrid classrooms or use of Zoom? What do you think will remain once the pandemic is far behind our history?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I hope first of all that a lot of us have learned about some of the positive things that technology can do for us that maybe we weren't aware about before, right? So like when we shifted online in the spring, I had never used discussion boards in my class, and of course students typically in my class would come into class and do like a 10-minute writing exercise at the beginning of class based on the reading. So of course I had to shift those online, and I found there was something really valuable about doing them online, because every student, I got to, usually they do those writing exercises, and then they would, I'd ask a few students to share, and so I'd hear a few, and the other students would hear a few. When they did them online, everybody saw everybody's comments, and so it was a more kind of equitable way for them to respond to the readings. And so I'm going to use that going forward. I'm going to continue to use the discussion boards, which it never would have happened for me, right? And so some of us might now be doing small, having video mini lectures that we're now going to incorporate and ask students to watch before class so that we can do something in class. Or we might be finding other things that we use in technology that we can use going forward. So I hope that's a positive that I hope that we can take away. At the same time, I think what we've recognized is how valuable it was to be together, right? And to be able to pay attention to one another in class. And to me, this research that I did for this book, and then just like living my life while I was going through this research and then through the pandemic, has really reminded me and helped me recognize how important it is and how valuable it is to give another human being the gift of my attention, and to get that gift from somebody else when we are in a classroom, like a learning environment together. So I hope that what happens going forward, and I expect this will happen, when we get back into our classes, we're going to be happy to be with one another, and that we're going to maybe recognize much more how valuable that time is, and that we can spend more of that time engaging with one another, and maybe do a little bit more of some of the stuff that we used to do in the classroom that we can do online, that's preparatory, or that's kind of just first exposure. Some of that stuff now can happen online. It was always available to us, but we learned about it now over this year. and that when we're in class together, we can really focus on engaging with one another and giving each other the gift of our attention.
That sounds excellent. Okay, I could continue paying attention to you for a long time more, but we have to finish. So we've learned so much. I'm sure the audience is absolutely happy about what we've learned regarding that attention deserves our attention, that we as professors are stewards of this beautiful limited resource, and that attention does not just, arrive like a gift from heaven, that we have to work on it. It's not effortless. And that it's
you took good notes. You took good notes.
Yeah. Right. I can send them to you. Maybe I get a little extra better grade. So,
yeah, exactly.
So no, this was pure intrinsic motivation on my side. So thank you very much, Professor Lang. This has been a wonderful talk for everybody. And we really hope this is not the last time we have you here at the Universidad de los Andes.
Hopefully in person next time.
Yes.
Thank you.
Para finalizar este claustro,
well, in order to close this convocation, we will have the closing remarks from the president of the university, José Antonio Guzmán. Professor James Lang, members of the board and the council, authorities, academic authorities, the members of the faculty, directors, assistant directors, deans.
Amazing talk. I think that it was very thoughtful, and the reaction that I've been looking through at the chat box is very interesting. People are saying that this is some of the best things that they have seen in the last time, and it's going to spark a very great conversation in our university. So thank you very much, Professor Lang, for your talk and your thoughts. El año que recién comienza ha sido...
This year that is just beginning is probably one of the most difficult in our lives, given the pandemic that we are still facing. It has changed the way in which we work. It has changed the way in which we interact. We are tired, and the whole world is facing a situation which is unprecedented, with dramatic consequences. The lives of people and the economy of many countries has plummeted. The university and academic activities has continued, but the way of undertaking it now has been very different to what it used to be. It is still too early to see what new normality will be like. But undoubtedly, as was said, we will learn a lot from today's experience. I am sure that for many years, we will be studying the consequence of the pandemic. I want to go back to thanking the university. I want to thank all of the faculty, all of the administrative staff, and our students for their effort during this time with such good results. We can clearly see the heroic task that you have undertaken. You've really met the challenge. This is a challenge that has not finished just yet. Things will continue being difficult, and we have been able to see the commitment and the unity from the university community. And this makes us very happy and very proud too. What unites us? It's not just friendship, loyalty, empathy. There's also a sense of purpose behind this, a common goal. We know that we're doing something that is bigger than just us, and that is a great contribution to our society. We are part of an institution of excellence that delivers an excellent education that contributes to each of the different areas of knowledge. But there are many other excellent institutions. I read about the president from a university in the United States who some years ago, lost his confidence in the possibility of the intellectual Catholic tradition, and for this reason resigned, in practical terms, to the unity of truth and his commitment to Christ. From then on, he was focused on putting together a more modern and more American university. In contrast, the ideal of our university declares that this search, integrating diversity in the seek of truth, illuminated by the Catholic faith, has been our roadmap for 30 years. Although this is not an institution that is formally considered a Catholic university, its intellectual project is based on that founding stone. We can integrate scientific truth, faith, and the teachings of the Lord. In this university, we accept diversity, but we all accept this assumption, and we know that this conviction does not limit our intellectual capabilities. Rigorous truth never clashes against revelation. Revelation provides light into scientific truth. As John Paul II said, faith and reason are the two wings that allows human to rise up. And this in human's heart allows us to want to know the truth and to want to learn about him in order to learn the truth about oneself. So with our work, we hope that we contribute to the best knowledge, and we hope to contribute in the seek and search for happiness. This has a big influence in our university. This is of utmost importance in our curriculum when we hire also our faculty. And it's quite a diverse university, but in order to establish and to execute our task, we need openness towards this twofold topic. It is very important for all of us who are part of the leadership team at Universidad de los Andes. If we are consistent with this foundational idea, we will be able to make an important contribution to the moral and intellectual debate taking place in our country. Social and political life becomes more rich with the exchange of ideas, with the contrast of respectful different ideas. And that is why pluralism in the university system must be expressed through the existence, through the promotion of different establishments and institutions that are diverse. The academic work of the teachers from Universidad de los Andes is an important contribution towards making a better country. We must make sure that the university becomes a meeting point, a dialogue area, and we must not leave aside our convictions and our points of view. Before ending, I would like to leave just a few minutes in order to talk about the topic that Professor Lang has presented, the attention of our students and the distractions that our students are exposed to at all times, a critical topic which is closely linked to what I was mentioning before. We want to form people with a common sense, with an opinion of their own, with reasoning, being able to have a consistent, a coherent look of what we teach them, and to combine that with the different stimuli that they have. We hope that they'll be able to distinguish what's true, what's false, what's important, what is not. We are facing a tremendously challenging task based on the curriculum, based on the teaching that we must work on. We're starting a year which is going to be difficult, which will demand efforts from all of us, but I'm absolutely sure that we will overcome this because we're motivated in providing the best for our students, for the country. We're totally convinced that we're doing something that is bigger than just us. That is the main end goal. Thank you so much. Yes, we want to thank the participation of all of the members of the panel, and with this, we bring this convocation to an end. Thank you very much.